Hello everyone, thanks for joining us today to another Akimbo Call webinar. In today's webinar, we're talking about system hardening. For those of you who haven't seen our webinar series, we're running these every couple of weeks on a different cybersecurity topic, aiming to be entertaining and educational about a range of things that will be useful to keeping your organization secure. So today we're talking about system hardening, and really what I want to get across from today's webinar is a lot of organizations talk about and focus on patches, passwords, and perimeters, but system hardening is another key step, and it's a key step that is often overlooked. When we deliver penetration testing services, very often many of the vulnerabilities that we exploit could have been prevented or at least made much more difficult to exploit, raising the barrier to entry for attackers if good hardening had been broadly applied in the organization. So, before we get started, let me introduce myself for those who don't know who I am. I'm Holly Grace Williams, and I guess you could summarize what I do as I break into computers for a living. So, we of course do a penetration testing service, and when I'm not doing pen testing, spending an awful lot of time building our tool suite, writing code to effectively enable security testing of organizations and systems. So, I'm coming at this topic very much from an offensive security point of view. And you might get a different viewpoint if you were to talk to somebody who is more interested in governance, risk, and compliance, those kinds of things. Both approaches are valid though. Cybersecurity doesn't just have one approach, but the approach I'm coming at this from is very much a pen testing focus, looking at how you could break the attack chain and either prevent an attack or reduce the speed in which attackers can take place. I think that latter point, reducing the speed in which an attack could take place, is an important one that is also overlooked. Incident response is difficult, and triaging security breaches quickly is difficult. So even just slowing down an attacker can benefit an organization undergoing a breach. Hopefully, we'll talk about going further than that though, and we're going to look at preventing system compromise altogether. So what are we talking about today? Um, we're talking about system hardening. This is a topic very much related to network hardening and things like network segmentation. We're not going to focus on those in this webinar. We'll likely cover those in a different webinar in the future. We're just focusing on system hardening. But network segmentation and network hardening in general is something that you should consider as well if you're looking at this as part of building up your cybersecurity strategy. So, we're talking about system hardening, and the point of view that I want you to keep in mind whilst we go through this topic is breaking the attack chain. So, what am I referring to when I discuss the attack chain? It's all of the stages that a threat actor might go through when aiming to compromise an organization. So, I think of this very much in terms of the penetration testing methodology. So, network mapping, user account compromise, privilege escalation, propagation, and gaining persistence, those stages that we go through during a penetration test. And what we're looking at is preventing each of those where possible, or hardening systems at every one of those stages. I think focusing on the attack chain is a good thing for organizations to do because it highlights the range of different controls that can be put in place to prevent any individual attack. And I think a lot of organizations don't look at the attack chain and they just focus on the payload of an attack. Certainly within the media and newspaper headlines and things like that, you hear about things like ransomware attacks. And I've talked before, both in our webinars and our YouTube series, I don't believe ransomware attack is a useful phrase. I don't actually believe there's any such thing as a ransomware attack. For me, if that sounds like an odd thing to say, for me, ransomware is a payload. If I am compromising a network and I go through those stages that I mentioned before, user account compromise, privilege escalation, propagation, and at the end of those stages, I steal intellectual property or I deploy ransomware, the vast majority of that attack was actually the same. The attack chain was very similar, and we're just focusing on the payload that is used. I think that's bad for organizations. A good example of that would be looking at something like different ransomware examples and actually looking at how the attackers deployed that payload. So here's an extreme example for you. This is the AIDS Trojan, first distributed in 1989 and often cited to be the first ransomware. And of course it worked very much like ransomware that we see today. Although there's a couple of noticeable differences like the lack of cryptocurrency, because the AIDS Trojan was distributed in 1989. In 1989, it was distributed on physical floppy disk, and it would lock a machine after infection and demand a monetary payment, $189 via banker's draft, as you can see here, sent to a PO box. Okay, modern ransomware is going to be a little bit different. It's probably going to involve cryptocurrency rather than a banker's draft. And also, some of the ransoms demanded are significantly higher. Not only because ransomware groups are not targeting individual machines, but targeting whole organizations, and a payment per machine soon puts that ransom up. But there's going to be other differences as well, like the fact that, well, they'll not be distributed, I guess, on physical floppy disk anymore, but a lot of ransomware attacks actually involve manual hacking techniques. There's actually a group of threat actors who are manually hacking into organizations and then manually deploying the ransomware payload. So there's some major differences there. A good example of the latter would be TravelX getting hit in 2020. So the very end of 2019, December 31st, 2019, into 2020, this attack lasted or the impact of this lasted about 6 weeks for TravelX. It was a very significant breach for them, and they ended up ultimately paying about $2.3 million in ransom because of this breach. But the payload was, of course, very similar in what it did. It locked machines and it demanded a monetary payment. How it was deployed, though, very different. And if we focus on that attack chain, here to give you an example of the attack chain, I've just listed those stages of the pen testing methodology, but you'll see a lot of resources such as the MITRE attack framework talking about this concept of an attack chain and the different actions, the different techniques that an attacker might use at each stage. But focusing on that attack chain instead of just the payload allows us to look at all of the areas in which we could prevent that attack taking place. So ultimately, when we talk about system hardening, we're saying cybersecurity is not just patches, passwords, and perimeters, but there's more to it than that. And one of the things that organizations should take a look at is system hardening. When I talk about your system hardening sucks and the idea behind the title of this presentation, in part that is because it's just a huge number of organizations don't do system hardening well. It might be ad hoc or it might not be done at all. And also, in fairness to many organizations, doing system hardening well is very, very difficult. But I want to give you an example of why system hardening is so effective and why I do ultimately think it's worth the investment, even if that investment ultimately is just time from your team to work through the stages of implementing this well. And to do that, what I'm going to use is really just one of my favorite penetration testing vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities in general, but I mean vulnerabilities that I use during penetration testing engagements. This comes up all the time when we're doing infrastructure assessments, be that because we have compromised a perimeter system and we're now on the internal network, or the organization is worried about something like insider threat. So they've tasked us with connecting to the internal network and looking for a compromise there. Go-to vulnerability for me is link local multicast name resolution spoofing. It's a bit difficult to say that one. You can abbreviate it to LLMNR spoofing if you prefer. Tricky one, but link local multicast name resolution is a protocol that's enabled by default on Windows machines. When we find it, we will grade the presence of LLMNR as a high-risk issue. Even though, as you'll see, LLMNR is not vulnerable because of some software weakness or some mistake in the developers producing that protocol. You could almost think of it as broken by design, where what it allows the threat actor to do can cause a risk to an organization. So it isn't the kind of thing that you're going to patch. It's for most organizations fixed simply by disabling this protocol. If you haven't heard of LLMNR, you would be in the same category as most of the sysadmins that I talk to. Most of the sysadmins we talk to haven't heard of this protocol, they're not using it, they haven't configured it. It's just enabled by default. And really that's what we're talking about with system hardening. It's looking through the configuration out of the box of your systems and disabling services, protocols that you don't use, and enabling optional security configurations that are maybe disabled by default. Some of those are disabled due to things like compatibility reasons, but looking through, is that compatibility impact something that bothers you? And if it's not, disabling it or enabling it as relevant. But to stick with this LLMNR example, if you haven't come across this, there's actually two vulnerabilities that we use very often. The presence of link local multicast name resolution, and then we'll also likely partner this with a lack of SMB signing, which is sometimes referred to as the SMB relay attack. I'll give you a brief overview of how these two things work, but in short, default configurations on Windows machines, that's why they're so impactful, and that's why they're a favorite vulnerability for us, because if organizations haven't got good hardening, they are going to be present and we can reliably exploit them. They've also been fully automated with attack tools such as Metasploit and specifically for LLM&R, attack tools such as Responder. Really lower the barrier to entry to attackers, but also just make our life easier. It's effectively click go in a tool and the system is compromised. So that is something you should bear in mind as a defensive team, because a very low barrier to entry, in my opinion, increases the likelihood that it'll be used in an attack, because less skilled or lower skilled threat actors can use it just the same as higher skilled ones. So, LLM&R enabled by default on Windows machines, and it can be abused to cause an interception attack. This can lead to credential theft. If it's paired with another vulnerability that I mentioned that's also present by default, the lack of SMB signing, we can pair link local multicast name resolution spoofing with SMB relay, and that would allow us to intercept an SMB communication and cause generally command execution against the target system. There's a couple of technical details that I'm skipping over here because they're not relevant, but powerful attacks that are present by default. That's the takeaway from this section. To show you how this works, though, if you haven't come across link local multicast name resolution spoofing before, is by default, machines typically use DNS to do name resolution. So if you're doing something like mapping a network drive or connecting to a file share, something like that, and you type a host name in, your machine will connect to the DNS server to determine the hostname to IP address mapping. The issue occurs if you've mistyped the address or if the DNS server is temporarily unavailable, something like that. The DNS server doesn't respond or can't respond to that DNS request. By default, Windows machines will then fall back to LLM&R. They'll also fall back to NetBIOS name service after LLM&R. That's something you should look into as well. The attack works very much in the same way, and the tooling is going to be very much the same. Responder can exploit both of those issues, but the fix is very slightly different. The fix is actually really easy. We'll get to that in a second, but for LLM&R, it's a group policy change, so it's a very simple one. So you're connecting to a network share or something like that. You ask the DNS server, where is this machine? It's unavailable for some reason, or maybe you mistyped the address and it doesn't have an answer for you. Your machine will fall back to LLM&R. LLM&R is a multicast protocol, and it effectively means your device shouts out to the local network. Okay, it doesn't shout out, it sends a multicast request, but it's effectively the same thing here. And what the threat actor's machine will do is simply respond to that request. It'll poison an answer and it'll say, hey, that server that you're looking for, that's me, connect to me to access that resource. And if you're mapping a file share, your machine by default will typically send credentials. The attacker won't get those credentials in plain text, of course, they'll be cryptographically protected, but they're then susceptible to an offline brute force attack, a very effective and very fast brute force attack. Typically these days, the hash that you would capture would be a NetNTLM version 2 hash, but yeah, readily crackable with tools like John the Ripper or Hashcat. Instead of capturing those credentials, of course, as I mentioned, the threat actor could abuse the lack of SMB signing and could perform an SMB relay attack as well. Both significant issues, both fixed in the same way. Group policy change. I've got a screenshot here of the group policy option because there's a little nuance that catches some sysadmins out that I wanted to mention. But in short, if you're not using LLM&R, which if you've never heard of it, you're probably not, disable it. It's really easy to disable. You go into group policy and you look for the turn off multicast name resolution option and you turn it to enabled. Yeah, quirk here. You are enabling the group policy object that turns off multicast name resolution. I've seen a couple of sysadmins that have gone in with the intention of disabling multicast name resolution and have therefore set this GPO to disabled. No, enable the object that disables it. It's an odd one, but just something to bear in mind. So a very powerful vulnerability that is very easy to exploit, but it's also easy to fix if you just spare a few minutes to configure devices in this way. Something to bear in mind as well. You need to configure this for all of your Windows devices on the network. It's no good just disabling it on a few, because a threat actor would just target the ones that still have it enabled. So when it comes to hardening then, if some of these options are that simple, there's protocol services that you're not using, or maybe security options that you'd like to benefit from, where can you find out more about your options? Well, there's a whole bunch of resources. Vendors themselves release a lot of documentation on this. Microsoft's website is full of documentation about the group policy objects that are available. their impact, some of the best practice guidance, and even in some cases things like the potential negative impacts of setting certain options. I mentioned some of them being set a certain way by default because of compatibility. Microsoft's documentation is pretty good at saying what impact would that have from a compatibility point of view. There's also third-party security providers. You've seen on the slide so far that we publish articles about some of our favorite vulnerabilities and some of our favorite hardening options. So that's another resource you can use. And of course, there's specific hardening guides from third parties, such as the CIS benchmarks. If you haven't come across the CIS benchmarks before, they're available for a range of systems, Windows, Linux, cloud providers, those kinds of things. And they are very long documents that list hardening options and what the recommendation for those hardening options is, with a rationale and a potential impact. So just another good resource. But the thing is, this information is it's out there, it's available. Check the vendor website and it will tell you clearly what options you have. It's just a case of going through that, making a security decision from your organization's point of view. Will we accept the compatibility impact? Will we accept the performance impact, whatever it is for each option, and then configuring them how you would like? And a lot of these options actually don't have very much in the way of performance or compatibility issues, as we'll see in a second. So an example here. Just one of the security options that's available under group policy is to digitally encrypt secure channel data. I've just picked this one at random, and you can see here, this is actually a cropped image from a full article on the Microsoft website, where it has best practice options. For these group policy options, you should set them to enabled. So it's very clear what you should do. There's no no problem that you might get mixed up as to which way it is. It's set this option to enabled. If you haven't come across this one before, secure channel data automatically encrypts things like credentials, but doesn't encrypt everything. This is just telling your device to encrypt everything. Some of the best practice guidance isn't this clear, where it'll just say, this is the option, set it to enabled. An example of that might be local administrator accounts. Because there's some nuance here and there's some administrative approach, if you disable your local administrator account and that machine has an issue, for example, it can't connect to the network, therefore you can't log in as a domain administrator account, that might have a maintenance issue for you. So some of the guidance is a little bit vague, like this one that just says disabling the administrator account can become a maintenance issue. But when you think about the context of what the option is doing and take a look at how your organization manages those things, you can make a decision on what you would want to do here. Maybe you keep the local administrator account enabled and use a solution such as local admin password solution, LAPS from Microsoft, or maybe you disable the local admin account and then use safe mode to do any kind of maintenance in the rare situation that a device is unable to connect to the network. So it isn't just a case of, the guidance is going to tell you exactly what to do. There are some decisions to be made, but most of them are just a logical approach based on the context of your organization. I mentioned compatibility and performance issues and things like that, though. And that was the reason that I picked the digitally encrypt secure channel data option I showed a minute ago. The reason for that is when you go into group policy and you configure those options to enabled, you'll get a warning that looks like this. It says, you are about to change this setting to a value that may affect compatibility. And I think some sysadmins would see something like this and go, oh, that sounds bad, and back out of there and hit no and just leave it how it is so as to not break anything. But if you actually look into it and you actually do test deployments of this, you'll probably find it is not going to cause you an issue. Specifically for this example, the compatibility issue is enabling it will prevent compatibility with Windows NT before SP6 and Windows 98 if it doesn't have the AD client extension. Probably not a problem for most organizations. I know a lot of organizations out there do have a huge amount of tech debt and they do have some old systems that they'd really rather get rid of, but hopefully none of you are running Windows 98 at least. So, system hardening. It's a bit awkward because there's several steps that you've got to go through. You need to determine your options, review things like the vendor guidance, review things like the CIS benchmark if that's a resource that you want to use, or resources from companies like Akimbo. Decide on your hardening profile. Some of them will be easy, like, yep, we're just turning this one on. That compatibility issue is not an issue for us. Some of them might be, okay, in this context, how do we manage that? Another good example would be caching credentials, for example. If you set a machine not to cache credentials and it loses network access, the user that machine is assigned to won't be able to log in. But if you assign it to cache credentials, then that could be a weakness where if the device is compromised, if an attacker gains access to a local admin account, they'll be able to extract those cache credentials. They'll be hashed, they'll be cryptographically protected, but it's a weakness you might want to do something about. So again, we're balancing security and convenience here. The recommendation typically that we give to organizations is allow caching for user devices, because the only accounts that should be cached typically would be domain user accounts, and they're much lower risk than domain administrator accounts. So we would say disable caching on IT systems, so the laptops used by your IT team, in case they log in locally as a domain administrator. Yeah, best practice says you shouldn't do that. You should log in as a user and privilege escalate when required, but we know in the real world a lot of people do log in locally as domain administrator, so it's just one of those hardening options that can save you in the event of a device compromise. So when it comes to deciding on your hardening profile, that might be as an organization, but it might vary very slightly for a few issues depending on the asset that you're actually hardening. And then ultimately, the easy part is implementing the system hardening. Once you've decided all of the things that you're going to implement, configuring it is relatively easy, because it's going to be using things like group policy and maybe some registry key changes. When it comes to grading an organization on how well their maturity is implemented, we do this a lot actually. We have a service security maturity reviews where we go into an organization, we look broadly at their security. How well have they implemented penetration testing? How well have they implemented incident response? How well are their security policies implemented? All of those kinds of things. When we go in and we do these for organizations, we of course have method of grading that maturity. I've simplified it for hardening here, just giving you 3 levels, but hopefully it gives you an understanding of how we would guide you in the direction of having a more mature approach to system hardening. And the lowest level of maturity is, of course, not doing it, having no hardening, or hardening not being broadly performed, just performed on a few machines or in an ad hoc manner, or of course where hardening is unmanageably complex. So you want to have a well-documented, published hardening guidance for your systems so that all of your IT team understand what the hardening guidance is, the reasoning that it's there, when decisions have been made, those kinds of things. And that's how we would first increase maturity, as well-documented hardening guidance. You can go further than that though, and it is something that I wanted to mention in this webinar, is manually applying these things, or even applying them in a controlled manner through something like group policy, is okay, but there's a further step that you can do. And this is what I'm referring to here with compliance with hardening guidance is automated. I'm a big fan of automation. So the next thing then is automating your compliance. And this is related to topics such as compliance as code. If you've not come across compliance as code before, it's a real broad area that's worth looking at. But just for a quick definition for the sake of this webinar, when I talk about compliance as code, I'm talking about codifying compliance controls such that they can be monitored and remediated automatically. Because there's actually a step of maturity further than just implementing hardening options through group policy, and that is monitoring those hardening options. For example, modern Windows machines have wdigest credentials disabled. The reason for this is wdigest credentials are actually stored in memory in plain text, and that means that if an attacker compromises a device, they can pull those credentials out of memory in plain text, so they don't have to perform hash cracking and offline brute force, anything like that. So it's really useful to an attacker that's able to compromise an asset to a local administrator level. They can then use that compromise to gain access to a domain administrator by configuring the device to store wdigest credentials and then waiting for or coercing a domain administrator into logging into that device. When they do, they can pull the password out in plain text and then ultimately propagate that compromise to other devices. So not only do you want to make sure devices don't store wdigest credentials, but you want to monitor to see if those settings are ever changed. Because if those settings are ever changed, it could be a significant indicator of compromise. So a lot of these hardening options are actually relatively easy to monitor. So you can have some code that does something like monitors the registry keys. This is the example that I mentioned earlier with link local multicast name resolution. When you enable that group policy option, what it actually does is sets a registry key on each device, and that registry key, as you can see here, enable multicast, and it sets it to 0, effectively disabling multicast name resolution. So it would be really easy then to remotely monitor that registry key, and if it's ever changed, that would be a security incident. This is one example, but certainly there's more that are higher priority, such as the W digest one that I mentioned. If that is ever changed, it's quite likely that, well, either a system administrator or a software developer has done something silly that you would like to talk to them about, or it's an indicator of compromise and that device is compromised and you should enact your incident response plan. So getting to the maturity level of securing these devices and then monitoring them is even better. One thing I wanted to mention as well, just before we close out here, is if there's all of these many hundreds of security options on devices, how many of them are set to their secure option by default? How secure are devices out of the box? Well, of course, it differs depending on the operating system and what version of the operating system. And it differs greatly depending on what guidance you're following and those kinds of things. But I've done a couple of experiments looking at the hardening guidance that we offer and then some common guidance such as the CIS benchmarks to see on Windows devices out of the box how secure are they. It's a little less than half of the security options are set to what we would recommend by default. They're not very secure out of the box. This is not necessarily a bad decision on Microsoft's part, but what they're thinking of is, balancing that security and convenience, and it's going to impact them if every time you install a Windows device it can't communicate with anything because it's got all of its options set to the most secure setting. Also, not all of these settings are the same level of impact. We mentioned LLMNR as a high risk vulnerability, if not a critical risk in many networks. But some of these settings are just things like password length or enforcing screensaver after a certain timeout and those kinds of things. Good options that you should do from a best practice defense in depth point of view, but not as bad as a specific exploitable vulnerability. So that is fair, but I would recommend looking through your systems and making sure that you're not running out-of-the-box configurations because they are not secure by default. If you're curious about this tool that I mentioned, it's Akimbo's Harden tool. It's a tool that we offer to enable organizations to monitor those configurations. So when I talk about getting to that higher level of maturity, not only do we give you guidance on how you should be hardening your systems, but we monitor each asset as well and make sure that you have good hardening consistently deployed across your network. And also if any of those machines have their configuration changed for some reason, this is a part of our continuous security testing and it will pick up on it very quickly. Those are constantly assessed and it'll flag that to you to say, hey, something's changed, you should maybe look into this. So that's just the way that we do it. But you could do it the old-fashioned way, look through all of the guidance yourself, make decisions yourself, and implement it through something like group policy. Anyway, to summarize everything that I've been talking about for the last half an hour, fully patched systems with strong passwords are not necessarily secure. It could be the fact that you have a default common misconfiguration or a security option that's not set that could lead to an easy compromise. Using tools like Responder, using tools like Metasploit, and exploiting vulnerabilities like the presence of LLMNR and the lack of SMB signing are honestly trivial vulnerabilities to exploit. The good thing, of course, is they're also relatively easy to fix. It is just a case of setting some time aside or using a tool to automate that monitoring and remediation for you. So that's another point to close out on is doing this stuff manually sucks. I would recommend working hard on the interesting aspects and automating the mundane ones, and also making sure that you can continuously monitor those assets. So if anything is changed, you can use that as an indicator of compromise. But in short, your system hardening sucks because devices aren't secure out of the box. And it just takes a little bit of effort to sit down and make sure that your systems are set to their secure options so you don't get caught out by easy vulnerabilities. And that's it. Thank you everyone for attending. I'll take questions in the chat now. And if you don't have time to hang around for the questions and discussion at the end, feel free to fire over your questions to info@akimbocore.com and I'll answer them there. Or of course, reach out to us on social media. We're active on LinkedIn and Twitter mainly if those work for you. Thanks.